10 minutes is good enough waiting time for all the people that could be lost after the change of the rooms. But thank you everyone for joining us for this small setting. My name is Peter Bohacek. I'm a research fellow at the Charles University at the Faculty of Social Sciences. At this panel, we're going to be talking about global governance at space and how new technologies can form a new types of governance. And we could not have probably a more qualified panel. I'm going to start introducing everyone, then I'm going to give sort of a brief introduction into the topic. So first, we'll welcome here Dr. Joan Johnson-Freese. She's a professor of national security affairs at Naval War College in Rhode Island, former chair of the National Security Affairs Department, author of many books on security, especially strategic affairs in space. Next, we have Dr. Pete Worden, Executive Director of Breakthrough Initiative, former Chief of NASA Ames, and as well as a retired General of the Air Force. And last person to introduce, last but not least, is Nikola Schmidt, research fellow at the Charles University Faculty of Social Sciences, and recently published also a book on planetary defense and global collaboration in space. I would like to sort of revolve the discussion today around these three nodes of global governance in space. One of them being sort of the traditional sphere of national security, of nation states, and alliances among nation states playing the major role in defining this governance. And then another node, sort of the one that we see upcoming now, around non-state private actors, whether commercial, philanthropic, visionaries, and so on, that play increasingly dominant role in space and how they could shape the global governance system in future in space. And the last one, more of a cosmopolitan and global perspectives on governance in space that is as well emerging, and that we could maybe find in the Outer Space Treaty and some of those cosmopolitan principles there. And just to give just a quick introduction to the topic, the space, I think, is very interesting in a way that a lot of these changes in the global infrastructure that we see that are happening in space that are much more apparent. One of them being that the most influential actors are changing. It's not only, the bipolar world of Russia versus the United States anymore. We have new actors from China, India, or Israel, or in space, Luxembourg, United Arab Emirates, and so on. But the change is not only, let's say, quantitative in number of new actors, but also in qualitative in different actors. And that's the new non-state actors that are emerging, that have breakthrough technologies that could be viewed as strategic capabilities that will emerge and are likely to emerge. It's coming from the overall change in the relationship between the state and the private actors. Whether you could say that during the Cold War, you had the state investing in research and innovation, which then trickled down into the civilian and commercial sphere. Now we can see the relationship sort of flip, and we see that the private actor is the one that has the innovative ideas and breakthrough technologies that then are, let's say, trickled down to the hands of the governments, and which rely on them for this new innovative technology. One of the things, maybe also for the start of the discussion, how future in space will look like, I'll mention the 2060 Futures Report that has been recently published by the Air Force. It was a colloquium of experts on national security, on space affairs, experts from NASA and so on, that sort of painted few scenarios how space is going to be governed and evolved. They analyzed three areas. One of them was the human presence in space, where the lowest threshold was focused on lower, let's say, presence of humans in space in 2060, where humanity probably wouldn't exceed technologically the barriers of how to deal with radiation and how to protect humans from radiation in outer space, where humans would rely on robots to do the majority of the hard work there. And they contrasted it with a scenario where humanity would have a presence, a constant presence on Mars, on the Moon, on other celestial bodies. So that was the human factor. Other factor they analyzed was the level of commercialization of space. whether it will remain as now about 1% of global economy, or whether it will grow to some 10% or even more, whether we will move to sort of just travel to space temporarily, or whether we and rely there on global navigation, Earth observation, or whether we will develop a true space economy where people stay in space for long periods of time, where people are able to extract and use natural resources in space. And the last factor they looked at the leadership. What type of a leadership and governance structures we will have in space, whether it will be governed by certain nation states and their norms, values, and ideas, or whether it will trickle down into some sort of a competition between nation states, rivalry, and some sort of a Wild West scenario. So these are some of the outlooks. And without further diving into discussion, maybe I would start the debate asking our panelists which one of these outlooks, whether sort of the competition between states, dominance of non-governmental actors, private actors, or sort of a cosmopolitan global future they see as the most likely, or whether it's maybe more of a mix between each other and how they could maybe play between each other and complement the different perspectives. And I will start with Dr. Johnson-Freese, maybe to ask the question, which one of these three scenarios is more likely in your perspectives, and how do you see maybe the future of space governance looking outward to 2016?
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you too for inviting me to this conference and an opportunity to come to Prague, one of my favorite cities in the world. I need to start by saying that the views that I'm going to express are those of just my personal opinion as an academic, and certainly not those of the US government. I think I see a good news, bad news story, and I'll kind of start with the bad news, and that is I see a continued dominance of great powers with a new twist, and that's kind of the good news, but there are all the indicators that I see do lead me to believe that there will be a continuance of great power dominance, and that is because everything in space, the umbrella issue of everything we talk about is the dual-use nature of space technology. The fact that the vast majority of space technology can be used for either civil or military purposes, and when military purposes, it's very difficult to tell whether it's for offensive or defensive purposes, certainly means that there is very little that the United States can do in space that China does not see as threatening, and there's virtually nothing that China can do in space that the United States doesn't see as threatening. So that kind of sets the stage for what I see as the national security communities in various countries seeing it as imperative that they remain vigilant and in control of the apparatus. Specifically, that again is this US-China competition that really precluded the Trump administration and really kind of goes back to a change of policy to 2013 when the Chinese had a high altitude test to what the United States considers its sanctuary orbit, where many of the exquisite satellites are kept, that the United States viewed as testing anti-satellite capability to an altitude it had not been able, China had not been able to reach before. And that started a turn to a more muscular policy. And of course, militaries anywhere, it's their job to see and be able to respond to worst case scenarios. So I think that really kind of set what is the worst case scenario here, and China began changing the policy to a more overtly muscular nature. And I say overt because that is the real policy change. Because of dual-use technology, certainly there have been capabilities for weaponization that have been around for a long time. But I think countries, including the United States, have long gone out of their way to specifically avoid crossing the Rubicon of overtly weaponizing space by using terms like offensive counter space, which is kind of an Orwellian way of saying weapon. But it was considered important not to do that. And now when you have military officers saying that they would like to see space weapons by 2023 in use or in operationalized. That is the change. And this is within a context of great power competition. And I can tell you that teaching at the Naval War College, a professional military education institution, our entire curriculum has changed over the past 2 years to one of great power competition. So that is the focus that we work within. So that's kind of the bad news. The good news is the new space ventures. It is something that for 50 years we've been saying it must happen. Space must evolve as a normal area of activity, one where there is government seed money, but then it transfers to the private sector for the real innovation to occur. And that is, in fact, where new innovation is being done. And Pete Worden is probably the best person I know to talk about that. So the things that are being done through the Breakthrough Initiative, through Elon Musk, through Virgin Galactic, that's where we are seeing real technological advances. But I think, again, as long as these advances can be used for civil and military purposes, there will be this continued emphasis among nations for a certain amount of control. That said, if you look at how will the new space change governance, I think there will be increased recognition of need for multilateral efforts in areas that benefit all spacefaring nations, especially those with a dominant interest, and that certainly includes the United States. Although the United States and many other great powers see the United Nations as very slow-moving and not necessarily always in our benefit, there are things that have happened at the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space over the past 5 to 7 years that I think give us real reasons for hope in terms of recognition that there are best practices that are in everyone's interest. And certainly this focuses on things like debris. But I think increasingly it will focus on new types of propulsion, new types of technological breakthrough, which I personally don't think there's any opportunity for the Outer Space Treaty to be significantly revised, because once you open it for revision, there is too much of a potential for it to result in demise. But there is an opportunity for addendums, for recognition of best practices and addendums. I don't think the Outer Space Treaty will either be obsolete. There are still things in it that are to the benefit of those countries with the most activity. And again, weapons are not banned. It is only weapons of mass destruction. And that gets into the legal issues of defining things like peaceful and weapons and all the things that have been under debate for so long. I think as well, the United States military, after the Indian ASAP test, really came back to the position of we need more multilateralism on issues that are of interest to all of us. So I think that too will push the national security community into areas of multilateralism that perhaps have not received the kind of support and attention in the past that it will need to do now to deal with these inherently multilateral, multinational issues that permeate the entire space field. So I'll leave it at that to start with, and happy to talk about the questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So maybe now I'll go to you, Dr. Worden, and ask you, you probably have the both views coming from the public sector and also now being the private sector on how the new space can change the way we conduct ourselves in space.
Well, I'm probably the most conflicted person here. I mean, I spent the first half of my career as a national security person, as a rabid advocate for space weaponization during the Cold War, and then I've spent the second half of my career, most of it working for NASA as a space science, and then the last 5 years working as a private philanthropic group that's focused on science. I think that I really agree with Joan that space will continue to be dominated, or at least some space, by the by large power competition, security-related issues. But I think that is limited to things in Earth orbit. And it's, and I'll get to the other part here in a minute, but that in Earth orbit, for the foreseeable future, virtually everything is going to be launched from the ground. I think it's just an extension of the oceans and atmosphere. The economic and security benefits and uses so intertwined and overlap that I see a continuing competition and cooperation, but it's really very analogous to the use of the oceans and the use of the air, and those are certainly significant security interactions there as it was in the past. I agree with Joan that I think that the international understanding has really been brought to the fore, first by the Chinese anti-satellite test a few years ago, which produced a lot of debris, and the Indian test. And so this really got to the fore where, for example, in the United States, that there are two security applications of space. I mean, one is the support to military operations by communications, surveillance, and so forth. And that's the one where people have thought about applying force from space. It's arguable whether that's a good idea or not, even from a military standpoint. But the other one is intelligence gathering. And quite frankly, the intelligence community is a bit orthogonal to the military, what I call war fighting community, and so it tends to be very much opposed to fighting because it threatens the critical assets. So I think we're going to see what we call protocols to the Outer Space Treaty that will begin to set, as we do with the oceans. There's sort of an overworked term of rules of the road. So, that's sort of the perspective I've got for the first half of my career. That space is so integral to a lot of countries' security. I mean, you see countries like France that are establishing a space force or space corps, or whatever it is. The United States has done that. China, I think, has. Russia has long had a military space arm. On the other hand, there is a different regime, and I do not see this dominated by terrestrial military competition. That's beyond Earth orbit. And in fact, a former student of mine has set, I think, 100,000 kilometers. That's Matt Daniels. He calls it the Worden line. I think he's trying to curry favor. But he's a senior policy advisor in the Pentagon. And beyond that line, you're really out of Earth orbit. And I see that's where a lot of the private sector focus is. And I'd say for more, it's not just, the issue of philanthropic science is what we're doing, and we're trying to search for life in the universe, and all of that is beyond Earth orbit. But also economic development, and this is a much different regime that is completely open, and there are several dimensions to it that are of great interest. I think the first one is the increasing private interest in settlement. And you see the world's richest man telling us that he's going to build giant space colonies, and he's going to use resources and willing to do that. To be sure, he has both, philosophical and visionary goals, but also I think financial goals. Another very rich man is who, unlike Jeff Bezos, has not used his own money is Elon Musk, and he has talked about settling Mars. And I know both of them, they are very serious. But they're not alone. A few weeks ago, there was an article, I think, online or in the press about an organization that exists in San Francisco called Open Lunar. These are compatriots of mine. I guess I'm listed as an advisor to them. But in 2014, most of them worked for me. One was the director of NASA Ames. And they really believed in a very utopian vision that in space we could establish new forms of governance. And one of them is the CEO of Planet, which the other part of his vision was monitoring the planet. He sort of realized to get money for that, he has to sell to national security agencies. But the other vision of these folks was lunar settlement. In 2014, we had a small conference that was attended by the co-founders of Google, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and by Steve Jurvetson, who was a big investor in a lot of these space companies, and a few others. And the objective of this kind of weekend meeting was, could we, what does it take to put a settlement, initial settlement? And the conclusion was that it could be done in about a decade for a few $1 billion if done privately. And that's within the range of these high net worth people. So about 2 years ago, a number of these folks formed an organization called Open Lunar. And to do this, they raised, I think, 30 or 40 million now to begin by landing small landers to look for resources, water resources and poles and moon. It's a very serious effort, and they now have the level of supporters like the Google founders that could clearly do this and do it in the 2020s. So that is a significant new visionary item. The other player that has entered this is government, but it's not governments that, in a traditional sense, these are small governments that see an opportunity to this beyond Earth orbit to take to involve themselves and become very significant. And in some sense, in the age of exploration, it's some of the smaller countries like the Netherlands, and that ended up being, playing a significant role in that expansion. I'd like to mention two in particular. One is the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, which has made economic development of space, especially space resources, is a major theme, and they put quite a significant amount of money, hundreds of millions of euros. The other part of that, which is interesting, is that Luxembourg has, understands that in order to do this, there needs to be understanding and agreement and consensus around the world of who can own resources and what can you do. So they have used their substantial diplomatic presence around the world to begin to try to develop consensus. They've signed agreements with China, Russia, United States, Japan, and a number of other countries, and they're working on quite a few more to try to move forward on this. And they've helped establish the Hague Working Group, which is a non-governmental but government-involved group trying to figure out the protocols. I think that's a very interesting development. And another country that just started to be interested, that you might be quite surprised with, is the Kingdom of Bhutan. Probably the last, Himalayan Shangri-La. It's an interesting country that's never been successfully invaded, thanks to the Himalayas. But the king has decided to use space as a way to inspire his people. And they launched a CubeSat a year ago, and they've done a few other things. But the interesting thing about Bhutan, and I sort of juxtapose this, that on the Luxembourg side, you have a very Western capitalist, profit-making, resources-oriented view. On the Bhutanese side, those of you familiar with the country, it established when it wrote its first constitution 11 years ago, a concept called gross national happiness. And interestingly enough, it appeals a lot to the people that are trying to establish new utopian settlements on the moon and Mars. And so I think that there is a different dimension where a small country that has a rather unique position and view on how people should live can actually be an impetus and sponsor in some sense of new forms of governance. The final one, of course, is that significantly beyond Earth orbit. In the case of my organization, we're interested in interstellar stuff. We're talking about things that will not happen the first probes for a few decades, and certainly the idea of being able to do anything at those distances is probably near the end of the century. But the interesting thing there is these are purely scientific questions to date. They're really, is there life elsewhere? Maybe if we found intelligence, then there would be much more immediate security issues. Do they have bad intentions, and can they do anything about it? Or should we communicate with them? But those are one of the reasons that we're here, and we've been in discussions with the policy people as well as the technical people in the Czech Republic, is that the only way that we believe in the next few decades is you can send things to at this distance at speeds that make it reasonable in terms of decades, is to build very, very small spacecraft. And some of you have probably seen I brought my spacecraft with me. The spacecraft we're talking about is a chip. This is a full spacecraft. And this, by the way, is another revolution in space that's really going to change how we think about it. In one sense, it disturbs national security people because they couldn't see these. But also, in Earth orbit, it's debris. But eventually, we would attach this to what we call a light sail, which is a 4 or 5 meter sail, and then you would place these on a mothership deep in space. You would launch maybe one a day, and then you hit it with a very, very powerful laser. And I mean, powerful. This is a kilometer scale laser with 100 gigawatts of power. That laser is itself a significant global policy challenge and opportunity. We think ultimately, in the initial research and maybe even prototype will be funded privately, but ultimately this is a public-private partnership. And it's an opportunity, I think, to talk about something that is clearly far off but important globally now. And so we're sort of hoping to have discussions about this. By the way, the state of the art today is it's called a Sprite. The 120 of these were launched 8 months ago and deployed in space about a month. These are also debris. So I'll pass these around if somebody wants to see what.
Great, thanks.
But one part of it is Earth orbit, which I think is evolving with commercial activities, but it's still largely government and has huge security implications. And the other is this very open, unlimited future of humanity in the solar system and beyond, and that opens some real questions, but opportunities for much different players.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a very helpful, informative, just even the discussion purposes, how we can look at it, just on one side, not to neglect the great power competition, but the other, understand the new dynamics of new space beyond the Worden line. So now I go to Nikola Schmidt. What is this global governance that is spatially and territorially unlimited, unbound, that we could think about beyond the Worden line?
That's what we have to think out about. I would start at, I'm an idealist, which means that I think that it's ideas now which are making changes in the way how we live. So when I was doing my PhD, I was focusing on cybersecurity, and what concerned me hugely on that research was that it's a fully open space. I don't mean like the outer space, but open space, the cyberspace, where everybody can somehow participate, develop some technology, the technology influence the way how we live. It has some security implications, etc. So it was kind of dystopian environment. where you cannot simply predict where the non-state actors step in, where the individuals will empower themselves absurdly and do some changes. And then I realized that it's not meeting the ideas I would like to see regarding the way how we live on this planet. And then I read the book of Johnson-Freese, Space and Strategic Asset, and I realized, okay, so there are several interesting ideas, and the idea says that in space you can do big things which can be worth to be followed by others, so we can inspire people around the world by doing programs like the Apollos. And because I studied security and international relations, I realized are there some topics which we can focus on, which will be cosmopolitan in nature. And I realized there is a planetary defense topic, planetary defense, which is kind of problem which cannot be perceived from the national security perspective. When it is perceived from the national security perspective, it's not solving the problem on a global level. It's more or less solving the problem for the particular country, which can actually endanger the other countries. And that's what is happening in planetary defense, even during some simulations, which we saw the last one in Washington, D.C. a couple of months ago, where the asteroid was about to hit Denver, and it was a simulation. And the scientists nudged the asteroid a little bit, and so it actually fell to New York. And because there was a representative from FEMA, they simply wanted to have the asteroid, hit the Earth in order to discuss what are the consequences after the hit and what we can do about it. But the point was that the risk corridor went across the Atlantic Ocean and across Nigeria. And what they were not talking about was that Nigeria is very rich for uranium. And when you are a superpower, the one you were talking about, which is capable to nudge the asteroid, and there is a possibility that the asteroid will be nudged to Nigeria. So what do you think Nigeria is going to do about it? Probably, obtain nuclear weapons. And these are, I would say, two perspectives on how can we enable some kind of global governance now, whether we think or whether we follow the ideas of national security or whether we follow the ideas of possible cosmopolitan security. Because if, let's say, people within a particular national security environment or community understand that nudging the asteroids and moving them to other countries will never make the Earth more secure. If they follow these ideas, we will definitely not live in an inclusive global governance system. But if we think otherwise, if we think, okay, so let's talk about the problem even with Nigeria, so Nigeria can be part of global planetary defense efforts, and can understand what's behind the possible decisions, can influence the decisions, can develop particular technologies during the time when the threat is still hypothetical and not detected. Then you are developing an environment where countries which are interested can excel in some technical niches, because understandably countries in Africa cannot cover all the possible expertise. And that's another moment when we moved forward with our research project on planetary defense with Peter here, that we met Worden about a year ago and start thinking about okay, there's an idea to build a powerful laser like 100 gigawatts. The other countries will immediately perceive it as a weapon. So what we can do about it, and that's where I began. We can do that. We will simply frame the whole idea, or let's say the whole project by different ideas which are more inclusive, where you open doors to others which can participate on the project, not necessarily on the policy level, but can develop some certain parts of the technology. And this kind of cooperation, of course, deepens confidence. And if you have, confidence between states, then the problem of, I'd say, the neo-realist tensions between the states is understandably decreased. So, and we have these tools called confidence-building measures, and we use them in various areas and sectors of international cooperation. So it's nothing new. But at the same time, there are some institutions now, like for example ITU, which have been quite successful when it comes to setting people around the table and organizing them how they are going to communicate, like with telegraph them, the telecommunication, finally with satellite orbits allocations. So there is no other reason why such an institution or other institution can help us to organize how we are going to operate powerful laser, which can be used for deorbiting orbital debris, which can be also used for some other purposes, and that's I think the most important part, because if we focus only on insecurities in our lives, then we tend to develop policies which last only during the time when we think the insecurity is over there. But if the insecurity or the threat never fulfills, then we will start asking why we have the policy which is addressing an insecurity which has never fulfilled. And that's the moment when we start realizing that we start following even the thinkers in cosmopolitan theory that are talking about that there needs to be some other issues to be solved, or say visions to be fulfilled, or objectives which are more civilian and scientific rather than necessarily security or related, and link them together. And that's the moment when you have various international scientific consortia like CERN or ITER consortia, which decided to develop machines or technologies which no single country was willing to undergo. I mean, the risky project to undergo, or which were too expensive to be funded by one particular nation. And it's also very complicated, to sell your electorate. The idea, okay, so let's develop a fusion reactor, which is not working. Nobody knows where it's going to work within 50 years. So it's really hard, to sell it in the democratic societies. But if you have international consortia where various countries are cooperating on fulfilling projects which might have some security implications, like the possible laser, not necessary for interstellar travel, but it can be used for interstellar travel, so which is still an application, but it can be also used for the security of the application, which is the orbital debris. Then you are in a situation that the whole consortia of states tends not to defect, because they would kick themselves out from a global project, which is maybe too complicated, but at the same time the risk of the project is shared within the nations, and the open doors and the principle of inclusivity actually introduce more countries now, which is the situation which we have been observing in CERN. So just to summarize the argument, I think it's important in space to find not necessarily which kind of technologies are dual use, because as you said, simply everything is dual use. But I think it's important to start framing the projects which we are developing in space as understandably civilian, but with these security related possible applications. And if the civilian projects if the projects are triggered as a civilian or as a civilian research initiative, then the consortia and, let's say, the governance model can be more easily inclusive than understandably in security-related projects. But the security application of the project is kind of additional feature of the civilian shape of scientific projects. Okay, so that's it.
All right, thank you. We'll stay beyond the Worden line in our discussion. It's interesting to see how that area beyond Earth's orbit could be viewed and could be dominated by this new space technology and perception. But certainly there are areas that have a big strategic value, whether if it's space resources rich areas, whether if it's scarce lunar poles that have some ice water that could be used for propellant or some other purposes. There are certainly many strategically valuable areas. And the question is if we are then able to continue to line of beyond nation space governance, if we are able to sort of continue, develop and use these areas and expand beyond Earth's orbit in a sort of a shared manner with that beyond the national security paradigm, even though they have big strategic value. And it's interesting if you think about new technologies. Even, you know, Martin Rees wrote the great book about global catastrophic risk, and there he talks about how new technology comes about and how scientists and come up with these new technologies, and it's never for the purpose of national security or any other you know, normative regime that you can it's always just later inserted into it. That scientist is not developing a nuclear weapon to be a nuclear weapon. He's a brilliant scientist and developing a new breakthrough technology that is just excellent and inspirational and something new. It's later that we come in and we put this new technology into some sort of a new regime, value regime, and that defines how it's later used. So I guess to carry on the conversation and go back to Dr. Johnson-Freese, is it even thinkable that, you know, we have beyond the Worden line the strategic, you know, areas, and that we start developing and using them with some sort of a new paradigm, as we can see new companies like SpaceX planning to develop these lunar bases, or will they always be sort of a victim or like in so-called state capture by these higher national interests?
Well, I think the emphasis, I guess I'd come back to 2 points, one about planetary defense and one about developing resources. When there was the big enthusiasm for mining asteroids and companies forming, 2015, the United States Congress passed the Space Act, basically saying, yeah, whoever can get there can keep the profits from what they reap. And I think that speaks to the continuing focus on national interest over kind of global development of common, you know, the common heritage of mankind and that. And I think it's also important to differentiate what we can all recognize when we talk about space debris or planetary defense, that there is an unfortunate collision between what are rational strategic interest and bureaucratic politics in any country. And if we look at planetary defense, of course it makes sense to do this on a global level. Of course it makes sense. But in the United States, if you look at the difference of resources in terms of money and personnel that's put into security versus that which is put into the kind of diplomacy which would be required to sit down and work out the governance aspects of planetary defense, it's overwhelmingly in the security realm. In the United States, people like me just keep arguing for just put 1/10 of the time, effort, money, and resources that you do into security issues into diplomacy issues, and we'd be a lot better off with the confidence building measures, etc. But realistically, in the United States, and Pete can speak to this better than I can from experience, the security community doesn't pay much attention to what's going on at the UN. Or even in the State Department sometimes, and certainly not with the same amount of resources. So it would be, I think what I would say is you would have to convince the security community that was in their best interest to support diplomatic efforts towards governance, because everybody works in terms of best interest and how those are defined. I wish in the United States we define best interest in terms of a happiness measure, but we don't. And certainly this administration has taken our pragmatic realm to the national interest to another dimension altogether. So I think there is certainly the need, the very clear need, to begin working on that now and planting the seeds and hoping to work towards protocols in that regard. But I think we would be overly optimistic to think it would be either in the short term or easy to do so.
Well, coming back to you, Pete, you talked about that we need to establish new protocols that will sort of govern us through. You, Joan, mentioned that as well. And also we heard that the Outer Space Treaty is not per se obsolete, that there's no place to open it up that would just lead to opening up all the aspects of it. So what is the best way that, that these private actors can get involved with the governments to forge these protocols, to come up with the protocols, so they're not as exclusive and that there's sort of an international process?
Well, let me use the space resources one, because I think that's probably arguably the nearest term issue beyond Earth orbit. It's going to face various countries. And again, I kind of go back to, okay, the U.S. did a unilateral statement that, okay, we can use this stuff, and it's restricted to American citizens and or American companies that are majority owned by American citizens. That is a rather traditional, nationalist approach. Sort of even go back to the 19th century mercantile approach. But I see, Luxembourg doesn't really have security. They have an army, it's about 800 people. It's mostly used for marching when the Grand Duke is around. And they're a member of NATO, however. But their interest is purely economic. And from that perspective, they're well aware that, and by the way, they passed a law soon after the U.S. did, that does not restrict the use of space resources to Luxembourg citizens, or even, you have to have some presence there. But and again, I think that this is why a smaller country, in their case, has a significant global diplomatic presence. And they put much of their effort into that diplomatic effort to try to get some sort of consensus. I know when they first, and by the way, truth be told, I'm an advisor to the Grand Duchy, so a paid advisor. So
fair disclaimer.
Fair disclaimer. That they understand if these things are going to be real, they have to be accepted globally. That if I sell some resources, whether it's water or fuel in space, or ultimately bring back platinum group metals or something, that in order to properly use it and sell it globally, you're going to have a consensus that this is a legitimate effort. So again, I keep going back that there's really only one comprehensive space treaty. It's the Outer Space Treaty. I mean, there is the Moon Treaty, which is sort of a 1960s sort of cosmopolitan vision that somehow imagines people are going to go get resources from the moon, and they're going to just give away any money they make for the benefit of all mankind. And I mean, that's a view of some, but it's a bit naive, I think. And that they're trying to do a global set of agreements. This is where there's, I don't know how familiar a lot of you are with the Hague Working Group. It was set up about 2 years ago. I think it's the University of Leiden, I think, or Delft.
One of the members is right there, maybe.
Right.
Martin?
Yeah, that started it, and it includes not only governments and government representatives, but the private groups that are involved in it. What it's trying to do is develop at least some ideas of what protocols to the Outer Space Treaty could be. And I think that I agree with Joan. It's first of all, it's a bad idea, and second, it's not going to happen to open up the treaty, but that certainly doesn't prohibit new protocols. And there are protocols to things like the deep sea agreements and so forth. So I see the real focus ought to be to take a specific issue, such as space resources, planetary defense, maybe large lasers and others that we can think of, and start forming working groups that don't need any official charter, and begin to say, what is a document or a framework that this might work on, and that gives you a starting point. And I think it's probably going to take a decade or more before these things become would actually be something that the UN might include as a new addendum to the agreement. But I also agree with the discussion. I think that the UN in space is beginning to do a lot more than it, when I grew up in the military, it was like, the UN is, what's that? And quote an evil dictator from decades ago, how many divisions they have. And but I think now there's an understanding that particularly in the space regime, I think in their case they're beginning to look at space debris, that rules of the road or protocols are understood by both major powers and private sector. It's a good idea.
Power to be used in situations. But I think this is the moment small states now can step in, because like Luxembourg, they don't have army now. When it comes to Czech Republic, and our perception of our national security being part of NATO is simply crucial, because that's the way how we can use our expertise in which we excel, like the chemical and biological and nuclear, not weapons, but dealing with the consequences of usage of the weapons, which is a center of excellence, NATO center of excellence situated in Vyškov, close to Brno. And recently I just read an article that we are considered as one of the best country in the world now when it comes to this kind of expertise, and that's because we simply decided for decades to focus on it. And that's let's say one perception of a small country, to take a niche and simply use it and excel in that limited expertise. On the other hand, the role of small countries now, from the national or global security perspective, is that we will never shape the world by power. And the way how can we shape the world is that we simply start talking to other small countries now, and that inclusive global governance is simply crucial for us to live in a world which is peaceful, and that's the power of diplomacy, and that's the power of powerlessness, and that's what Václav Havel was talking about at the beginning of the 19th century, that our way of living in a peaceful world is simply to include Russia at that time. It was a very important statement in US Congress he made in 1991 or 1990, just after the revolution. And I'm not saying that the country is necessarily following his ideas after 30 years now of peaceful and political fluctuations, but they are still inspirational, and they would inspire us now as political scientists who are advising politicians in the Czech Republic, telling them that take the technical niche and start thinking about how can we include it into some global consequences, and not necessarily on a security level, but on the scientific level, on various levels which will simply link the world together. And I don't think it's a low power of small states, because the problem of small states in this perspective is that they think, I'm moving to the space resources, that we are not powerful enough or rich enough to trigger initiatives within the country, like supporting companies to develop technology to mine the asteroids. But look on Luxembourg, they are necessarily richer in absolute numbers than a country which is 10 million of people, and Luxembourg is about 1.5 or
600,000.
600,000. So
during the day it goes up to 1 million.
Yeah. So that's what we are trying with Peter here in Czech Republic, to convince several political representatives to focus on particle niches and gather the expert around it and develop not necessarily technology, but the ideas how to use the technology. And the laser technology is a nice example, because it was decided years ago to develop these laser centers in Czech Republic, because we were excelling in the technology for decades, even during the communism era. And some of the scientists which are still working today were developing their laser-related technologies like photon detectors in the 70s and 80s, and the detectors are flying in space on NASA spacecraft. So there are some selective expertise which can be used by a small country, and then it's up to the politicians to simply use it in a relation of a global, inclusive governance system. And that's why we do like we call it sometimes a giant laser system, because it's so provocative, and that there is simply no other way that I believe that such a system need to be used under an umbrella of a global consensus, and this consensus can be reached when everybody understands what is the purpose of the mission, and that's where the small countries can begin, because that's the power of the word. That's what Michel Foucault argued for years. The power of discourse to frame the narrative of foreign policy of a small state, which will step by step push the more powerful states to simply follow norms which they even developed decades ago. So, and you asked me a question, what I was thinking about my answer, and that was
About global governance for space resources and how to ensure that their use of exploration of space is for the benefit of all countries.
We don't have a cure for that, and we both, I think, believe that it's a little bit naive. That people will share their success if they mine some minerals on asteroids with countries which were not involved. But I remember the situation at the United Nations, COP was about 2 years ago. There was a representative of the space industries invited to talk, and they openly started talking about fees, and he explicitly said, please, let's introduce these fees, and we are fully fine to share the benefit with the mankind. But the point is, who's going to make the decision how this kind of money is going to be used? But United Nations can be an answer. Even small countries like Czech Republic is investing into a development program of poor countries, and the programs, especially in Czech, they goes to billions of crowns. Not necessarily the public money which is gathered by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I don't remember now the budget, but the NGO people in need they currently have budget about 3 billion Czech crowns, which is about I don't know, $200 million, and they do significant change in poor countries now. And the discussion at the UN about 2 years ago was about the same. The money from the asteroids can be actually used in poor countries, and the amount of wealth which can be mined in asteroids is so overwhelming that if we use just as 0.1%, it will make a big difference in these countries. So this was a discussion at the United Nations, not necessarily favoring this idea, but at the same time, that's what the social politics is about. If you would like to live in a world which is peaceful, it's not necessarily only about the national security, it's also about making lives of people well, so they don't necessarily tend to do bad things, if I say it that way. And unfortunately, we still live in that world of countries, but at the same time, there are cosmopolitan theories like Gareth Wallace Brown, which unfortunately cannot be here because he's currently going to have a child within several days. And Gareth is a nice proponent of cosmopolitan world where there is no superstate or there's no necessarily no centralized authority on the global level. But he's posing that we simply should begin exactly on the level of small states, where the small states follow cosmopolitan responsible foreign policy, and that's I think again where the small states can play a significant role. Because if somebody is rich enough to go to space and mine the asteroids, why not small countries just raise a hand and say, let's talk about how we share the benefit. It's understandably complicated if the small states now are participating and investing in the project, and so why they are raising their hand. But there are various arguments, and that's one of the arguments I said before. If you would like to live in a peaceful world, we don't necessarily need to spend, cut 20% from the wealth. You can cut like 0.1%, and it will make a significant difference.
All right. Thank you. And maybe to come back more to the great powers of rivalry between China and the US, with you, Joan, it's we know that when the International Space Station was being built and put together, the Chinese were not part of that. They're still maybe a bit too sour about not being involved in those plans. Now the plans for the Chinese space station are coming together with participation of several European and Western countries, but not from the US so far. There is some kind of a, I'm not sure if it's exactly a law, but limitations for US scientists in participation with Chinese scientists regarding space. And we do see projects of permanent lunar settlements and missions that expand beyond the Worden line, as we use it here. Do you see that that future, that expansion in space will rather be along these two nodes, China versus US, and then trying to get more partners and international cooperations? Or can you imagine that China and the US come together and start developing some sort of maybe a bigger lunar settlement or some sort of a space infrastructure together eventually?
Well, of course, the Chinese think in much longer terms than the United States, where we think in 2, 4, and 6-year periods according to political elections. So the potential for US-Chinese cooperation for those kind of ventures, I think, is fairly long-term. Long-term by US standards, perhaps short-term, mid-term by Chinese standards. But having said that, there are still areas, and by the way, the legislation that prohibits bilateral US-China cooperation was due to 2 lines put into the NASA Appropriation Act by one individual who has now left Congress, but no one has taken the initiative to move past that, and I think the political forces that led in that direction are even stronger now. But that being said, there is a great example of of many countries working together towards, again, what are absolutely rational, obvious answers to questions, and that's the IEDC, the Interagency Debris Committee, where put a group of scientists in the room, and it's very easy to agree on what should be done, and they don't do anything that isn't on a consensus basis. And they, a few years ago, had a consensus report of here's what we should do, we must do to begin to mitigate debris. It was a consensus report including scientists from the United States, China, Japan, Russia, countries that don't necessarily politically get along, but were able to see a question and address the question and answer it. Of course, that report got passed to the politicians, and there it died a quiet death. Getting back to what's rational at a strategic level doesn't necessarily translate into political reality. The other point is that in the past, when rules of the road or code of conduct was pressed, it was the original one was originated in Europe, supported on and off with the United States, and then died because there were certain countries that felt they had not been involved at the initial writing. But it was a top-down process. I think now, to go along with what Nikola has said, there is an opportunity for small countries with technological capabilities to, we have an expression in the United States, punch above their weight, to carry more influence than they might otherwise have, and take these best practices forward. I think it needs to be done in a way of not this is the right thing to do, but instead this is your best interest to do. I'm afraid with great power competition, countries are simply not thinking of what's the right thing to do, but they will act even uniformly in terms of what is in our best interest to do. And things like planetary defense and governance over new technologies is in their best interest. So I think there's a real possibility for cooperation, again, instead of top down, but ground up, grounded in technology advances, that it will be in the best interest of great powers to stay ahead rather than being reactionary to them.
Yeah, I would just to add one idea, not necessarily idea, but just to make it a little bit detailed. In the policy paper, then, which we will soon circulate, we are talking about critical mass of states, and that's the moment where you have enough amount of small states gathering around and talking about how to proceed in, let's say, developing a specific technology, for example, and not necessarily the laser, but I think specific technology. And when you are in a situation that you simply start interest superpowers, so they start asking themselves why we are not in, and or we are not influencing the way how they are thinking about it. And there's a really great historical precedent, and that's CERN. United States didn't want to be part of CERN for years. They even invested a huge amount of money to develop their own collider. But within 8 years or 10 years, they simply decided it's nonsense, because the pool of scientists in particle physics is simply finite. There's a limited amount of people which can participate in it, and they don't want to compete with they didn't want to compete with the CERN at that time. So finally, they decided after I think 25 years to step in. And what's important there is, and that's what we can do, despite the fact that we are not the decision makers, is to shape the founding treaty of an initiative where the initiative is open, inclusive, as the CERN was. And one day we will simply reach the critical mass of states participating in the initiative, and the bigger ones will simply have to follow, because they will be, either excluded or they will be participating, and that's the advantage you are talking about. Because if you are a superpower, you still can be threatened, by the developed technology in future of those small states which were capable to organize themselves around the table and decide on which technological niche they are going to focus on. And that's simply, I think, the power of the powerlessness, as our president was talking about, that we need to put these small states around the table and convince them that it's a good strategy.
Mm-hmm. Well, getting everyone involved, obviously there's a lot of problems with coordination and making sure that we're all on the same page and consensus. So Pete, do you think, could you just maybe mention a few obstacles that could arise if you are trying to put as many people as together, for example, to develop a laser system that could send us to the nearest star? What are some challenges of putting everyone around the table and having them be involved?
Well, I think the biggest challenge has already been discussed, that technically you can generally come to a consensus, but politically it's very hard to ever come to a consensus. I mean, and one of the things that this is where things that are worked bilaterally, and I don't have access to all of the detailed Luxembourg agreements with various countries. In fact, there was a bit of a political fuss because the U.S. ambassador released the one the U.S. wrote. But each one is different, but it overlaps in something. And again, I just to follow up with Nikola's point that a country that I mean, there's 180 countries in the UN. Or so that that's not a huge number or an impossible number for one country to begin to write bilateral agreements with a large number of them. And I think this is in something that that if you actually brought it formally to try to get consensus, there's sort of there's an exponentially more difficult possibility of everybody to agree. But if you start having, say, the bulk of countries that have got a network of bilateral agreements, and then it begins to be more multilateral, I think that it's sort of backing into a situation that you really want to get to. So I would advocate that it's planetary defense or lasers or whatever, someone who will own their resources, that getting several. And it's much easier, obviously, with a smaller country to begin to take this on, to say that we will work that, and at the same time to have these private actors very heavily involved in these fora. One of the other things, I'm going to be frank on these, that one of the things that prevents a lot of these things is who's going to pay for everybody getting together. And the private actors, like Open Lunar and others, generally have means to kind of bring together the discussions. So I guess I advocate two things here. One is that I think most people, even maybe the most rabid nationalists, think it's a good idea to have some level of consensus globally. That to get probably a smaller state to begin to take on this as a project and begin to form bilateral agreements. At the same time, have a series of fora. I mean, we're doing one later this week on the specific laser issues. So you now begin to have a community of people that have thought about these things from a legal, policy, technical, political perspective. And I think that it's a process that maybe over a decade or more will result in a kind of something that people might have said, well, that should have been obvious, we should have done that. And again, I use some of these things that like the international air traffic agreements, the World Radio Conference, and these other things. I mean, those, if you had come and started those and said, well, we want to try to get a treaty through the UN or something that says that this is how we're going to manage frequency allocations, it would have gotten nowhere. But there began to be a number of agreements. And that's an interesting one because it grew out of the International Telegraphic Union, when it was founded in 1865. So, but in these space things, I think when we begin to found those, I'm very pleased to see that Luxembourg started, and involved in these, and other countries are now involved.
Well, could you imagine that this initial initiative could come first from non-state actors, from private actors, to form some sort of an international, group of, let's say, the group coalition of the willing for some specific big thing, and then later be joined by states?
I think so, but it's useful to get one or more states that involved initially. That, if nothing else, to act as a sounding board and to begin to schedule meetings. I mean, I think it's a lot easier to get people that you want to talk to at a meeting that has, say, okay, the Czech government is sponsored this in some degree, like this meeting, and because it, as powerful as these emerging non-state actors are, they still have no official level. I mean, if Jeff Bezos wants to establish something about space colonies, I mean, people may come if they're technically interested, but if he has policy agreements, it would have to have some sanction, I think, by, or at least participation by the State Department or somebody else.
Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway, that we have new emerging private actors, but we still have to coordinate and cooperate with nation states and avoid falling into the great power rivalry beyond the Worden line. So thank you everyone for
I shouldn't have said that.
No, I'm going to use it all the time. Thank you for all for coming and for paying attention to our discussions. I think this will be also available online later after symposium, and thank all our panelists for a fruitful debate.
Thank you.